Hello, Catherine.
Coleen Rowley, thank you so much for rejoining me again on Organic News on Awake Radio.
Yes, it's great to be there.
So I'm just going to read a little bit about you. You worked as an FBI agent investigating crimes, including organized crime and some acts of terrorism in the United States from 1981 through 2004. From 1990 to 2003, you held the position of Division Legal Counsel in the Minneapolis FBI, responsible for legal and ethical training of FBI agents and police officers. During your FBI career, you also worked for a brief period in Paris and Montreal, conducting liaison with foreign police and intelligence agencies. In August of 2001, FBI agents in Minneapolis arrested highly suspicious French-Moroccan flight student Zakaris Moussaoui on a visa overstay. So I'll let you tell the rest of it. Like, why are you a former FBI agent?
Well, in the FBI, we have an early retirement. It's probably, and there's a pension. Obviously, if you can make it to I was in the old civil service, and so I actually had a pension. Some of the newer employees now have a more portable, like a 401k type thing. But the bottom line is I spoke out as a whistleblower against the cover-up of the truth about 9/11. At least the part I knew. I didn't know as much, there's a lot more that I later found out, but I knew parts of the FBI failures were being covered up. So when there finally came a Joint Intelligence Committee inquiry that Bush and Cheney fought against for several months, but finally they couldn't stop that. And when that occurred, I really told the truth to them. I wrote a memo and also delivered it to the FBI Director Mueller, as well as Internal Affairs for the FBI. And then I took it a step further and took it over to the senators themselves, at least two of them, who I knew were on the committee, because if you don't understand the bureaucracy, even in the course of official inquiries, and of course people talk about this with JFK, with other, official inquiries, there's still lots of ways that through minders and gatekeepers that the truth still doesn't come out. So I took my memo about this directly to, it turns out, Senator, what's her name? The one in San Francisco. I'm forgetting her name right now. Anyways, they weren't the heads of the committee, but they were on there and they were asking questions. My memo then leaked a couple of days later to the media. And when that happened, it served as an impetus for an Inspector General investigation of the FBI failures. Unfortunately, they did not investigate the cover-up itself. That was part of the reason I was speaking out, is because of the cover-up for 8.5 months. And I was assured that the Inspector General would also look into the cover-up, but of course they didn't. They only looked into the three main failures in the FBI. And the other thing it did was it helped the family victims of 9/11 had already been pushing for the 9/11 Commission to have an independent investigation, even outside of Congress. And so my memo really spurred that on, and that then started 3 months later. But the whole problem with all of this is that even though I wrote a memo 8.5 months after 9/11, and even though it did lead to some bits of truth, both in the IG report as well as the 9/11 Commission, also I testified to the Senate Judiciary, so there was some truth in all three of those official inquiries. But they took 2 to 3 years for those to come out. And in the meantime, even within weeks of 9/11, they had already begun this agenda, which was to launch war in Iraq, to basically commit a lot of, to legalize a lot of completely illegal things to give the war presidency more power. So those all began by John Yoo and others that legalized those things within a couple of weeks.
So,
and so this cover-up worked. Unfortunately, the cover-up itself worked to a great extent.
and what was it exactly about? What did you know for sure?
Well, what I knew, and again, it's a small part of all of the stuff. Most of it is a lack of sharing of information. I wrote a piece called WikiLeaks and 9/11 What If for Los Angeles Times. And the bottom line is if the agencies had acted on the information they already had, the case I knew about was the Moussaoui case, and if the Moussaoui matter had been acted on, they could have, I shouldn't say they would have, but they could have learned that he was connected to bin Laden and that there was this plan to attack the United States. And that was already known. So what happens is Moussaoui confirms that, okay, because there's already memos throughout the summer that bin Laden is going to attack. But now they actually find someone training in flight schools. That information would have dovetailed if it had been shared with the Phoenix agent who had already recommended checking into flight schools right away. And if they would have checked into flight schools, they could have uncovered Mohammed Atta. Atta stood out like a sore thumb, just as much as Moussaoui. And if they had begun to follow up on this, the July 2001 memo that then they said afterwards they had not read, they could have learned it that way. The other thing is the 9/11 Commission found that even publicizing this, if they made this information known to the public and shared it with the public, that could have prevented 9/11. So there are at least 4, and then there's been a Star Tribune reporter who has found out that if they had traced the information from the search that they wanted to do, our agents asked for an emergency search in August. And this was briefed to right up to George Tenet. And George Tenet did nothing about it. He can't explain. He said it wasn't my job, but he did nothing about it. And so if they had acted on that, one of our newspaper reporters found out that could have prevented. So there's at least 4 or 5 different ways that if they had acted on all of the information that was coming in, and to include the Moussaoui case, which I knew about, that could have prevented 9/11. Now, of course, after the attacks occur, there's just complete lies and cover-up. We could have prevented this no matter what we would have done. No one would have imagined a plane would fly into a building.
Really?
Just really nothing but lies and cover-up for several months. And even then, when bits of truth start to leak out, my memo was one, but the Phoenix memo leaked out 2 weeks before my memo did. So even when there are bits of truth that leak out about this, and some of the truth, by the way, has not come out yet. Some of it's still being covered up. For instance, why did the CIA not tell the FBI about the big meeting in Kuala Lumpur that Al-Qaeda had held? And that 2 of the people in this meeting then had visas to come to the United States. Okay, so to this day, we don't know why, because the CIA has never told the truth about it. So it's a very frustrating thing to see that officials, after the worst happens, and again, this isn't necessarily because they had some kind of nefarious, thousands of people had a nefarious plot or whatever, but when they do have these mistakes occur, they don't tell the truth about it. Because I call it mistakes, but our agent called it criminal negligence. And so when this occurs, you can fix negligence, by the way. Negligence is easy to fix. It does not require launching wars all over the Mideast and countries that had nothing to do with 9/11. But fixing negligent errors, and certainly sharing information, could have been fixed. But instead, what they did was quite the opposite. They actually made the government information even more secret after 9/11. So they went in just the opposite direction. And it's all because there's a cover-up. If the truth was known, they would not have been able to turn on warrantless monitoring to collect non-relevant info about, lots and lots of Americans and lots of people all over the world that doesn't pertain to terrorism, because already they claim they had so much information they couldn't even make sense of it before 9/11. So if you can't make sense of the information you already have, what good would it have done to turn on the warrantless monitoring, the illegal warrantless monitoring, and, double down and collect, millions times more? So again, the truth really matters. If this had been known and quickly known, a lot of where we are now, which is 10 times, many times worse than 9/11. We're in far worse, more precarious, more dangerous. We have smart people writing every day about our empire, so-called empire, is in real trouble. And we are really kind of almost looking at a World War III nuclear holocaust, especially if Hillary Clinton is elected and or Cruz. The two of them are almost certain to push Russia and maybe China into a World War III, which is, we have a real dangerous thing ahead. And it's largely because the American people do not know the truth.
I wanted to, I made a few notes. The first thing I wanted to say is, it's got to be kind of obvious and also frustrating when you're doing this work and you think you're on the same side with, people with the government, and, you don't know who's on your side and who isn't. And then when you find out the people that you think should be working with you are working against you and undermining and covering up the things that you're, trying to expose.
Yeah, I think, if you go all the way back now, 15 years, almost 15 years to 9/11, there were a lot of good people in government, much more so than now. I think that I've been out since 2004, but there's a lot of things that have combined in the meantime. One of which is just simply war. Once you go to war, as we are now, and millions of people have died, 9/11, only 3,000 people had died. So if you consider how difficult it is to tell the truth about a situation where 3,000 people have died, now consider the problem when we have millions of people that have been killed and died. It's far worse. And the government, in order to stifle people from telling the truth, they have launched an insider threat program. Every office has an office where fellow employees are supposed to report anyone who doesn't seem to be on board with, top-down policy and management. I think, bottom line is we really don't even have much of a democracy now, since 9/11 has really done what bin Laden had hoped for, which is to completely destabilize the United States. And he's long dead, but his dream of a small group of terrorists, because they were pretty small at the time, they were not nearly what the level of jihadism and terrorism is now. At the time of 9/11, it was a much smaller group. Right. But he thought that if they could just have a dramatic attack, that then the United States would overreact, do stupid things. Fear makes you stupid, and that then the Al Qaeda and this Wahhabi Saudi Arabia originated form of Islamic extremism, which, by the way, I'm not an Islamophobe, but there is this problem of Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, funded Al Qaeda and still continued funding these Islamic extremists in Syria and elsewhere. This small group that bin Laden had was able then, and of course they had the luck of falling on the Bush-Cheney administration, who thought, oh good, we get our new Pearl Harbor, we get our chance to do what we've always wanted, which is launch wars in the Mideast to achieve full spectrum dominance. Cheney, who had suffered, suffered is not a good example, he had witnessed how Nixon and the presidency had lost power after Watergate. And if you go back through Cheney's comments throughout his career, he had always thought that was wrong, that the president needs to be more powerful, as Nixon was before, Nixon went down. And so he had vowed all through his, decades that once, if he ever got the chance, he would restore this power of the presidency over Congress and over the courts. So that's what he seized on. After 9/11, he got John Yoo and Robert Delahunty to start writing these things that would increase the power of the all-powerful, they call it war presidency, etc. So you can see that that Bin Laden was, I don't know if he was lucky or whatever, but we just had lots of our own officials in place that then did the stupidest and most wrongful. By the way, I would say that they did this innocently. They knew that this was going to be wrong. They knew it was not justified, but they used this new, quote unquote, new Pearl Harbor. The neocons call it the new Pearl Harbor. They used it in order to take this country really off the deep edge.
Right.
And this is where we're at right now with our new presidential campaign. Probably Hillary versus, by the way, I call her KILLARY. Most of the Democrats do not understand that she is even more dangerous than Donald Trump. They were so partisan right now, we have that two-party problem. But even Donald Trump has not called for the things that Hillary Clinton has called for, which is she's just a complete neocon.
I believe I found this video that I was looking for, miraculously enough. It's General Wesley Clark admitting that the wars were planned, 7 countries in 5 years.
Exactly.
Yeah, let me just...
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper. He said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense office today. And he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
It goes another
The truth is about the Middle East is, had there been no oil there, it would be like Africa. Nobody is threatening to intervene in Africa. The problem is the opposite. We keep asking for people to intervene and stop it. And there's no question that the presence of petroleum throughout the region has sparked great power involvement. Whether that was the specific motivation for the coup or not, I can't tell you. But there's always been this attitude that somehow we could intervene and use force in the region.
What do you say to that, Coleen?
Yeah, that's completely 100% correct, that Wesley Clark told the truth. He wasn't supposed to put that out. It's been cited a lot. But there's a lot of confirmation for that. I'll just mention a few things that completely confirm what Wesley Clark said, one of which is Richard Clark's book, The Counterterrorism Chief. And he says even that late September, he's pulled aside a day after 9/11. Now if you think how awful that is, the whole country has just watched people falling out of a building and the horrible trauma. And these guys are basically gleeful that they're going to get to go to war. And either Cheney or Bush or both go to Richard Clark and they say, find everything, we're going to go to war on Iraq. And Richard Clark says the same thing as Wesley Clark just said in the thing. He says, well, Iraq had nothing to do with this terrorism. And they said, find it. You tell him to find it. That is in Richard Clark's book. He's pretty credible. He was the chief of counterterrorism. He went in 60 Minutes about this as well. The other one is O'Neill, the Treasury Secretary, sat in those meetings, the cabinet meetings, and he wrote a book, the same thing, that they were talking immediately about going to war in Iraq. The other way I know it personally, I have another confirmation source of this, which is another official source. I ran for Congress down here between 2005 and 2006 against our incumbent, Republican incumbent, Warhawk, John Klein, who was a retired colonel, lieutenant colonel, who carried the nuclear football for Reagan and Clinton. So this guy was plugged in. His name was John Klein, retired lieutenant colonel, but because he carried the nuclear football that could destroy the world, and he was so trusted by Reagan and Clinton, that he was plugged in. And he wrote an article for a neocon publication that said the exact same thing as what Wesley Clark just said. He said, now that we've had this attack, we're going to look at all these other countries and we're going to have wars and we're going to reshape the world in our own image and this type of thing. So he was trying to, of course, put the best spin on this, but he wrote it for a neocon publication. And when I ran against him in 2005 to 2006, I found that article and I go, no wonder this guy has been, head over heels promoting the Iraq War, even when the Iraq War went sour. Because I ran in 2005 to 2006 when the Iraq War had gone sour, and he was still promoting the Iraq War. He was taking junkets to Iraq and coming back on our public radio and saying how wonderful Iraq was, etc. Well, then when I found that article, I realized that he was, inclined in the neocon group. And the other really bad thing about this neocon group that started off with their project for the New American Century, because this came from when they adopted this so quickly after 9/11. Where did it come from? How were they able to put plans together for attacking 7 countries in 5 years? Okay. Well, the neoconservative group had been planning this. And this is a group that's connected to Likud in Israel. There were only 25 signers of the project for the New American Century that said, when we get our new Pearl Harbor, we will start the war with Iraq. Okay, that was written, I think, in 97. Cheney was a part of it, but there were only 20. William Crystal, Robert Kagan were the founders. And by the way, I just have to mention Robert Kagan, the founder of the project for the New American Century, is now the top endorser and advisor to Hillary Clinton's campaign. So, people that think that she's such a great presidential candidate really are not paying attention at all. The guy who really created this whole problem of going to wars in the Mideast is now the top advisor to Hillary Clinton. But anyway, there were only 25. There now are thousands. This number of neocons, and they have a sister group called the Humanitarian Interventionists. And they're on the Democrat side. The Humanitarian Interventionists, as they're called, or neocon libs, so sometimes they're called, are in the Democrat Party. The neocons themselves are in the Republican Party, but they control both parties. A lot of people call it the War Party. And they went from 25 signers literally now to almost every think tank in Washington, D.C. is just filled with these neocons. And it's a very sad thing, because the people of the country don't know any of this.
Right.
They all they know is, when they have a candidate to stand up and say, we've got to do this, and they'll all cheer for their for their party leader. They don't know anything about why we're in the mess we're in.
Yeah,
and why do we have this $19 trillion of debt, etc.?
Yeah, they need to stop watching, the regular news. I mean, some of it might be some truth, but mixed in with a lot of additives and preservatives, But I've been interviewing like a lot of different people. Most recently was a Jennifer Lowenstein, who's like a professor in Middle Eastern Studies at Penn University. She said something just recently similar to what David Swanson said. He wrote something called War is a Lie, and both of them had said, like over the last, 15 years post 9/11, right, like, where is the improvement? I mean, there is no improvement. Al-Qaeda was larger and now morphed into ISIS. And Jennifer Lowenstein, just recently said that, the U.S. just keeps putting, more fuel to the fire and, of course, creating more terrorists, which, seems to be exactly what their agenda is. It's not to end terrorism at all.
I'm glad that there are some scholarly types. That's actually what's needed. A lot of the scholarly types have succumbed to this, either the humanitarian intervention. I kind of follow groups of scholars in different ways. And even Democracy Now! To some extent, you would be surprised that over time, and 14, 15 years of perpetual war, most people have a difficult time continuing this anti-stance to the empire and to this imperial militarism. And even though it's blowing back, even though it's getting worse, right, it's a psychological need for people to make their peace with where they live and what they're a part of. And we are all a part of this empire. So it's very, very difficult to continue to kind of tell the truth about things.
So, okay, a couple of things. What you just said, it made me think of, everything that's supposed to be temporary ends up becoming chronic because people just end up making money off of it. So, like cancer treatment, even for instance, maybe at the beginning people start out, actually wanting to cure cancer, but then so many people are making money off of it that it becomes nobody, the cure for cancer never, if they do find it, it never gets public because people are now making too much money off of it that they don't want the people to know that there's a cure for cancer. And so, I've been saying this myself for a long time. Like, you can just feel that people don't want to get to the answer. Like, they want to take the scenic route because there's so many people, with these wars, the weapons industry is like making so much money off of the wars, and not to mention, right, their pursuit of oil. Who knows? Depopulation could also be part of the agenda. But I wanted to also bring up HR14.org and releasing the 28 pages. And if you know or spoke to anybody who read the 28 pages.
No, that's a good, I don't think I've spoken directly to anyone who has read it. It turns out I saw an article just a week or two ago that very few, the congresspersons who have signed that, I think there's 40 some right now, at least. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong. But there are at least 40 some congresspersons and senators that have signed the bill to have the 28 pages released. And I think they have read it. But, there's 450 congresspersons and senators. And if only, that's a small fraction. And I don't think, for instance, in Minnesota, our two quote-unquote liberal senators, Al Franken and Amy Klobuchar, I doubt very much whether they've gone into a skip to read those 28 pages. And so really, besides making them public, in many cases, and especially if you're in a state where like in our Minnesota, where people believe that their two senators are liberal. They think Al Franken is progressive. If that's the case, then they at the very least should ask why haven't you read the 28 pages, okay? Then if you read it, then you might want to decide to make it public for everyone. Because I don't even think very many of them have read it. But of the ones who have read it, they said yes, it's very, it seems like Saudi Arabia or some members of the Saud hierarchy, there's evidence that they funded, at the very least, enabled, helped, and funded some of the Al-Qaeda terrorists.
Right.
So that's pretty damning.
Yeah.
And then the fact is, there's a lot more about Saudi Arabia that just recently our country seems to have, they aren't saying this publicly, but they are not boosting Saudi Arabia as like our top ally. They're still selling them weapons, and Saudi Arabia is using these bombs and weapons to kill the Yemeni population. But the United States itself has not turned sour on Saudi Arabia, but their enthusiasm, as if you go back to the Bush administration with Bandar Bush and calling him a member of the Bush family and everything else, the enthusiasm for Saudi Arabia seems to have diminished. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but this 28 pages should be released. And I think Obama promised to release it, but he lied.
Just quickly, because do you mind if I bring Marcy Wheeler into our conversation? Do you have to go at all?
No, you can bring Marcy in. That would be great. I can stay on for a little bit longer.
Okay, great. Hold on 1 second while I add her to the call, because she is... Okay, wait, sorry. I feel like I haven't done...
She's great. Marcy Wheeler is great.
Okay, here we go. Hopefully...
This is Marcy.
Oh, Marcy Wheeler, thank you for joining. You're actually on still with Coleen Rowley, who's still with me. She has a few more minutes. I figured I would just, add both of you, since you were scheduled at 7:30, and I'll just introduce Marcy. You write widely about legal aspects of the war on terror and its effects on civil liberties. You blog at emptywheel.net. And you said recently, after setting up a showdown that the Department of Justice looked to lose, the Department of Justice all of a sudden discovered and implemented an alternative way to access Syed Rizwan Farook's phone, even though for months they had claimed to need Apple's help to access it. While it looks like the DOJ backed off a fight they seemed sure to lose, even since Monday's announcement, the DOJ has renewed its determination to access other phones, most of which it can probably access via other means as well. Ultimately, there needs to be an affirmative protection for companies that build security into their products, or the government will continue to attempt to chip away in secret. So that pretty much right, like along what we were just saying, it's the little people are losing more and more of their privacy, rights, while larger people, like just before this hour, I just wanted to mention that, the Panama Papers, I interviewed James Henry and Andrew Hanauer over these Panama Papers that the government knew about in advance and did nothing about. So Marcy Wheeler, thank you for joining me on Organic Media. Can you?
No, I just lost you.
Oh, yeah, I hear you now. Marcy?
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Talk about how the FBI still wants to, trying to gain access into Apple's secure iPhone.
Well, there are a couple of other cases. There's a New York case that had already gone to a judge, which sort of precipitated this. He's one of the magistrates who's who was part of what was called the Magistrates' Revolt back in 2006, 2005, that you needed a warrant for location data. And he said, how can FBI ask you to basically to unlock these phones when it wasn't required under KILLARY, which is the law that requires telephone companies to help spy. But there's that case. There's a case in Boston, which has a very similar phone. And, basically the FBI has all these phones sitting there waiting to get in. And they're looking for an excuse to force Apple to rewrite their own software so that it's very easy, not just for the FBI, but also for local law enforcement. We know that New York City's DA has 175 phones that he wants opened. There's a guy whose son committed suicide. He wants in the phone to get to know his son. Jim Comey, when he testified last year about the need to get into these phones, he said we needed to help solve car accidents. So in other words, the FBI is sort of coming up with extreme cases or a terrorist case, although there's no reason to believe there was anything useful on that phone, and lots of reason to believe there was nothing useful on the phone. But, the FBI is kind of using its power as the big law enforcement, the big bully. Coleen can correct me here. Mm-hmm. But to lower the standard for everybody else. So it's easier for, say, your local law enforcement to get into your phone just because, drugs or what have you.
Coleen, did you want to say anything to?
Yes, I wrote something entitled James Comey Wants a Worm in Every Apple. That basically echoed exactly what Marcy just said. Number one, this was not at all about that phone in San Bernardino. There was Richard Clark agreed too. There's almost no chance of that phone containing anything of value. And so if you think about Comey willing to go out and dramatize this nationally, publicly, even submit himself to being grilled in Congress, and fundamentally that's a lie. He knows it's a lie that there's anything of value on that phone. Okay, if you want to unlock phones to get further evidence of child pornography, by the way, that is one of the big areas that they do want to unlock phones on is child pornography. Obama listed that as the number one type of case when he was giving a speech. Okay, but be honest about it. Tell the truth. Don't hold up the San Bernardino phone and cry about the people that have died there and of course mislead those families. Okay, so I wrote that, and then I wrote the second thing, which is that I guess I just said both things, but essentially Comey has a track record himself of having even signed off on torture tactics as well as the warrantless monitoring. So when he's going in front of Congress, every media host will say, we so respect James Comey. They'll always hold him up on a pedestal because of what they believe about him. But in truth, he went along with pretty much everything after 9/11, all of this legalizing of the illegal. He went along with almost all of it, just as Mueller did, Robert Mueller, the then FBI director, and they essentially are both two peas in a pod. They're kind of the straight-jawed, considered to be law enforcement professionals. But in truth, when the law was being undermined, especially by the after 9/11, they essentially went along with it. And so, people really should keep that perspective when they do go out and make these dramatic speeches.
Right. Coleen and I, you've got two of the biggest skeptics of Jim Comey on your show, which is pretty remarkable because there aren't many of us. I'd like to say Jim Comey's famous for having run up hospital stairs in 2004 to try and prevent Alberto Gonzalez and Andy Card from getting John Ashcroft authorized the Stellar Wind program. And what we've since learned, so that's why he's famous. That's why every later he went to Coleen, who was then in charge of the secret that authorizes warrants. You need to approve this because we can't go to Congress to approve this warrantless spying program, and you have no authority to tell us. Basically, him bullying a judge to do what he had refused to authorize on his own because he didn't want to get. And yet he gets this, endless amounts of PR from 2007 to now for having basically just moved the shell of illegal spying under a new shell. And so, what one should be very, very dubious of Jim Comey.
I just wanted to add a brief comment that it just seems that the government does what's easy, like it goes after the low hanging fruit and doesn't bother to go after like real bankers, be they and I was just mentioning to Coleen that in the previous hour I was interviewing two people on the Panama Papers that the government knew about and didn't do anything about. And just a couple of nights ago, I watched this documentary called Prison Kids, and yet they're putting 16 and 17-year-olds and charging them as adults in United States prisons.
And I've made that argument, in fact, that very early on, when Jim Comey started going after encrypted phones, I said, look, if we shut down every technology that helped crooks, we would start with corporations, because corporations facilitate a great deal of fraud, murder, what have you. And I've since kind of moderated that. And well before the Panama leaks, I've been saying, we can't have shell corporations, according to Jim Comey's logic, because frankly, shell corporations have less societal value than encryption does, because encryption protects all of us. I don't know about you guys, but I certainly don't have enough money to have a shell corporation to hide my money in Panama or Cayman Islands or what have you. And so, basically what the FBI is doing is picking and choosing which technologies they want to shut down. And they want to go after Apple because it gives all of us encryption, even though the bad guys, and Coleen probably already said this, but even though any competent terrorist, any competent pedophile, any competent is still going to be able to get encryption because those software programs are out there and they can get them overseas. Whereas you and I aren't going to be able to have an encrypted phone if Jim Comey takes or Apple encryption away. And yet, Jim Comey has been utterly silent on these shell companies, which we know have helped terrorists. They've helped, large scale drug cartels. They've helped lots of theft. They facilitate crime just in the same way, but on a much larger scale. But they also help rich people, avoid taxes.
Also in this situation with the FBI, trying to get into this phone, Farook, of these people in San Diego. I was mentioning to Coleen earlier about interviewing Jennifer Lowenstein, who is a professor in Middle Eastern Studies at Penn University, a couple of weeks ago, and how, the United States is basically just adding fuel to the fire, and not really wanting to get an end terrorism. So, why doesn't the FBI make more of an effort to get to the source of terrorism? Because she clearly points out, as does that documentary called Drone, that all these wars do, all these drone programs do, is create more terrorism.
Right, and if we were really serious about cracking down on terrorism, we wouldn't be an ideology that feeds terrorism.
Coleen, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I obviously I agree with that problem of wars. There's a quote I always use, which is that a poor man's war is terrorism, a rich man's terrorism is war. They're the flip sides of each other. and they serve to ratchet each other up. This was I mentioned Bin Laden's plan from the start. Use terrorism to get the U.S. to start wars. Then we'll use more terrorism. I think there are people who understand this. There are some in government. They don't know what to do. They feel like in a way they're trapped. I think even to some extent, Obama has recognized this in his last couple of years. Part of his Obama doctrine is that I think he has recognized this to some extent, that we're actually helping fuel terrorism in many, many different ways, especially by helping these rebel groups in Syria, etc. I think he's kind of recognized this. But now you get into the actual power of trying to stop it, or how do you curtail it? Because as you said, the military-industrial complex is so strong now, and the war profiteering is so bad. Going back to James Comey, I just got to make one more comment. We should have another talk about James Comey when his decision, if it ever comes out, to prosecute Hillary Clinton. Because Comey, let's assume he is what we think he is, which is his reputation is far better than he deserves. If he backs down on prosecuting her, that means that his decades of watching Hillary Clinton that go all the way back to Watergate, him being a deputy counsel in Watergate, and knowing that she had already done all this cheating and hiding of things in Watergate. He already knows that. Now, if he backs down on prosecuting her now, I think that we can safely say that Marcy's and I's comment about James Comey should be tenfold.
Yeah, we'll do a special show, you and I, Coleen, on beating up on... Because again, the man has the most stellar reputation, and it's very rare that you hear people like Coleen and I who can point to the reasons why people should be a lot more skeptical about him.
And if you're going to do that show on here on Organic News on Awake Radio, because that would be I would love to host it. And I also I always remember what Bill Binney said about terrorism and the NSA, and he himself had said it that they get more money when there are problems and when there's more terrorism. So it's actually like even, the money and the problems just keep fueling the terrorism and he was the math coder working at the NSA.
Right. I mean, the FBI has gotten not just a lot of money, but a lot of authority. I mean, they've gotten a lot of authority since 9/11 to do things that they previously hadn't been allowed to do, and at the same time, they're not prosecuting banks anymore. The numbers of white collar prosecutions have gone down consistently, even though the banks crashed the entire economy. I mean, they did $14 trillion. I saw a piece with Liz Warren today. Talking about, she was beating up on a guy. It was actually great. So everyone should go look up Elizabeth Warren beating up on this guy who says we don't need more regulation. But she cited the number of $14 trillion that the Wall Street crash, the 2008 Wall Street crash, caused. 9/11 was horrible, but it caused in the billions of dollars of damage, not $14 trillion of damage. And yet we're not going after bankers. We're just going after the terrorists. We should go after both, but we're just letting bankers go free.
And I believe the banks are actually larger today. They've increased in size. I believe it was Nomi Prinz that had said that a couple of weeks ago. So they're even more big to fail or jail. I mean, the bigger they are, the more they're going to fail. But I mean, I hope I live to see the day where this country actually jails a banker like they did during the SNL crisis, when William K. Black was the attorney for that.
Right. It's been really since Black was in charge that we've really gone after the bankers, and yet they keep doing more and more damage and doing. I mean, and we're just talking about the housing crisis. We're not talking about the Forex exchange or some of the other rate manipulation that they were doing that really hurts localities, that hurts municipalities. And yet over and over again, they just keep walking,
Coleen, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, that diversion of resources and making terrorism the number one priority. At one point, even before I retired in 2004, the FBI was misstating, but they had at least half of all personnel in the whole United States diverted from healthcare fraud, from all various kinds of white-collar crime to terrorism. And Mueller was caught actually lying to Congress about it because healthcare fraud mandated a certain number of work hours. The legislation, the statute actually mandated a certain amount, and he had a fib about it. And then when he was caught, he said, well, you can understand I had to put everybody into terrorism. And they gave him a pass on it. But that, I think, is part of this whole rotting, internal rot. Empires that we are, don't actually necessarily lose foreign battles, even though the United States is also losing. I think also all these wars, in most ways, they're losing. But the rot that occurs internally in an empire is how this empire falls. And this is one component, and it shows how it's linked. Marcy just showed how the diversion of resources into terrorism and war takes away even from domestic resources that would actually otherwise catch our rogue criminals. And it's not just financial frauds. There's a whole bunch of, the FBI investigates 300 different crimes. And they range, everything from murders, all kinds of horrible crimes. And you can see that diversion now is allowing these other things to go on. And I will just mention one other thing, is the active shooters. The active shooters that the FBI refuses to call terrorism, even though somebody for no good reason will go into a church, a school, a mall, a parking lot, and just shoot people. Every time I see these stories on TV, which is almost every other day, by the way, now, active shooters have gone up to almost 3 times. In 2 years, they've tripled. And this is when there's a mass shooting. The FBI only counts it if there's 4 or more. So the recent shooting at the airport, they killed one guy and the perpetrator and wounded a few others. That one has counted as active shooters. They called it an active shooter. Every time the news will say, we don't know the motive. We don't know the motive yet. Well, the motives are completely senseless. These are people who want to solve their personal problems by going into a public place and shooting as many people as possible, because the American culture now, from every movie out there from Hollywood spewing out, shows you that that's the way to solve your personal problems, which is to go into a public place and shoot a lot of people. And then you got your president every day talking about wars and enemies. So it's very common that this is a blowback. And very few people understand that this increasing number of violence itself in the United States is a blowback from the wars and from this culture of violence. So we're rotting. The overall thing is we're rotting from the inside here, based on what we're doing in trying to achieve full spectrum dominance over the world.
They're not calling what happened in Flint either. They're not calling that terrorism, but yet, if somebody offshore did that to this city in the United States, they would sure as heck be calling it terrorism. But because the higher ups in the city itself are responsible, they're not calling it that.
Right, although we will see the U.S. Attorney in Detroit is investigating Flint, and we'll see whether she comes up with, and so is the Attorney General, but I have a lot more trust in the U.S. Attorney is a pretty no-nonsense woman who, we'll see whether she comes up with anything, but I think there's good reason to suspect that she might. So I have hopes yet that somebody will do some time for Flint, but maybe I'm not holding my breath.
And I asked earlier James Henry, the economist, if the FBI is going to be looking into the Panama Papers. Do you think they're going to do that, Coleen?
Well, so far there's been no public publicity about Americans that have been involved in these offshore shell companies, etc. I understand that there will be. They won't go maybe up to the highest level of officials. Now, if they went up to people like Hillary Clinton, probably they wouldn't be looking. I don't know. Someone also wrote that Hillary Clinton just found a better way than a shell company, which is a foundation. So she can accept all this money through a private foundation. And what's the difference between that foundation accepting money from Saudi Arabia and all kinds of foreign countries that have conflicts of interest that are getting her to do what they want, and a shell company? So, but the Panama Papers, I've heard, they're supposed to at least inculpate some Americans. It's kind of interesting why they didn't put those out first. They put out these indirect connections to Putin and Assad, etc. But apparently there are some connections to Americans. And we may hear about it at some point.
McClatchy actually did a piece on. So there are only 211 Americans, which raises real questions. But we also don't know where these documents came from, and no one knows even the name of the source who gave them to him. So it's possible that whatever source gave them to the journalists either skimmed out a lot of the Americans or what have you, or is trying to protect Americans. But regardless, there are something like 211 Americans that have been ID'd so far. Some of them are just buying property in Panama. But if you look, McClatchy did a story, and just about all the people McClatchy named have already been prosecuted. So in other words, which I find really interesting, you're just that what we're going to find out is that a bunch of crooks do use Panama, but we're not seeing, as Coleen said, we're not seeing the people that we're not seeing the Mitt Romney types, who we know Mitt Romney used the same kind of vehicles to hide his wealth. And yet we never see names of him or senators or, other members of Congress or governors, what have you. We never see those in these leaks. And I find that really curious.
And they say that it's not even illegal.
Right, it's not. It's not.
But yet, standing up for your rights and protesting ends people up in jail and arrest. I find that pretty ironic.
There was a book written several years ago by a former New York Times reporter. I think his name was David K. Johnston. And the book was about how wealthy people hide their money so they don't have to pay taxes. How they hire good tax attorneys to find loopholes and do all these gyrations so they don't have to pay taxes. And it was a very credible book by this Johnston. And the bottom line is that's what's going on here. The people that we look at as leaders, as officials, are not really with us as a group. The Democrats believe that their leader is Hillary Clinton. The Republicans think their leader is whoever, and
whoever.
whoever, yeah. And the bottom line is their leaders are really not with them. Their leaders are part of the global elite. Yeah. They have actually more in common with the other kleptocrats around the world that are all doing the same type of thing, getting wealthy, trying to hide their assets so they themselves don't have to pay taxes in their own country, etc.
Because we're pretty much out of time, and I just wanted to make 2 points. First, I didn't really even get to bring up this. You posted it, Coleen, which is kind of what made me call you. I thought we would talk about the shocking 63% of Americans that support torture. Do they understand the social consequences? I thought we would talk about that a bit, and we didn't really get to it. But I always feel like I have to mention the fact because I was doing like a lot of studying about the Fed and the where money comes from and how it's made, and that it's created out of debt, it's loaned at interest, and it's basically right. It's just created out of nothing and it just perpetuates debt. I just always feel like this point needs to really be, because I don't hear anybody talking about it enough. That money doesn't, what real value does money have? I posed that, I ran into Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, from the Earth Institute at Columbia. He came by. There was a protest against Hillary Clinton up by the Dakotas. She was going to a fundraiser, and I was up there, filming, taking pictures, and Jeffrey Sachs showed up, and I mentioned that to him. I just feel like that really that point doesn't get brought up enough. I don't know if either of you have anything to say about it, but I just feel like real wealth is getting destroyed and replaced by man-made wealth, or
Right.
some kind. Go ahead, Marcy.
No, I mean, I think you're right that it's just about financialization and spinning zeros and ones into dollar signs, and that's not really helping people feed their children.
And they want to make a cashless society, so they're going to make it even worse.
Right.
So again, I want to thank Marcy Wheeler of EmptyWheel.net and Coleen Rowley, former FBI agent, for joining me on Organic News. Do either of you, just say if I missed a website or a blog that you want to tell people about.
No, thanks for having me.
Okay.
Always good to be on with Coleen too. So she's a real hero.
Okay, thank you both. Thank you to both of you, and keep up the great work.
Bye.
Okay, have a great night. Good night.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Okay, so that does it for this Tuesday, April 5th, Organic News on Awake Radio. I did go over by almost 3 minutes. Please look for the podcast on Awake Radio and the number 1 on the YouTube channel, and please support us. We really, really need it. Thank you. Speak truth to power. Good night.